The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will unpack Premier Doug Ford's tax alleviation measures for businesses hit hard by Donald Trump's tariffs. It's a new episode of On Poly. Then, from the secrets behind political polling to the complicated politics of oil, we bring you the Agenda's Week in Review. That's all next on The Agenda. Hey, partner. Little sugar to start out with there.
Yes, yes.
And let's do the T-shirt check-in off the top here. I know everybody's looking forward to, well, maybe not you, but all normal people are looking forward to the Stanley Cup playoffs, which are starting not too long from now. People in Ottawa are very excited because it looks like the Sens are going to be in. The Leafs, of course, are going to be in, and God willing, not lose in the first round as they usually do. But I wanted to say for a lot of people in the province of Ontario, the playoffs have already started. What, you ask? Well, I'm going to tell you. That's why I'm wearing this T-shirt today. These are the Brantford Bulldogs, formerly the Hamilton Bulldogs, now in Brantford, and they are already into the second round of the playoffs. I went to a game last weekend. They dispatched the North Bay Battalion. So sorry to the folks in North Bay, but the Brantford Bulldogs have got it going on, and now they are playing Oshawa in the second round. So all of which is to say, the playoffs are already happening for a lot of places all over Ontario already.
And we had somebody write in not that long ago about the Brantford Bulldogs. Did you ever actually get to a game?
I did. I went last weekend. I went to the deciding game, Game 5, against North Bay, and it was I'll tell you what, these kids, they're all kids, right? They're teenagers. They play for keeps. They are, they're trying to impress NHL scouts that they are ready for the NHL at some point. They play hard. They play fast. The quality of play was amazing. The building was full, 3,500 people in Brantford. And apparently the team is doing so well that they are about to build a new $140 million arena. Wow. They don't call it that, of course. They call it like a sports entertainment complex or something. Yes. But it's an arena. Yeah. And they're about to build a new home for the Bulldogs. So go Dogs. There we go. What do you got on?
I meanwhile am wearing the Wawa Goose, a colleague of ours here.
What team is that?
I don't believe it's a team at all.
Oh, okay.
Wawa has, I think, had 3 goose sculptures built in their town, and I think they're on their 3rd, if I remember the history correctly. I've never been to Wawa, but I nurse this idea someday of doing a road trip in northwestern Ontario, and maybe someday I will get to Wawa and see the goose in person.
Take me with. I'd like to go to Wawa as well. Never been there. I don't think I've been there either. Okay.
JM and Steve on the road.
In Wawa. I know. It's a beautiful thing. Now, remember last week I brought in this, I thought it was kind of a beautiful old, what was it? It wasn't a photo. It was kind of a painting.
Or
painting.
Engraving.
It was an engraving. Yeah, I think there it is. That was last week. Okay, for those who are listening on podcast, we're showing a shot of me holding up the picture of the first ever meeting of the Ontario Parliament, except I said it was 132 years to the day last Friday that the legislature met. Turns out I wasn't 100% clear in my description. It was the 132nd anniversary to the day of the first ever meeting of the Ontario legislature at Queen's Park. I needed to add those 3 words. From 1867, Confederation, until 1893, the legislature did meet in other locations. Niagara-on-the-Lake was one location. The foot of Parliament Street in Toronto, Parliament and Front. Yep. That's why it's called Parliament Street. Yes. That was another location for the legislature before it ended up at Queen's Park. And the anniversary I was referring to was the very first sitting of the first Parliament at Queen's Park. So I'm happy to clear that up. And David Harrison, you keep me on my toes. That was very good. David likes to listen to the podcast, and he occasionally sends us messages when I screw up.
Next week, it's going to be a bit of a different episode because you are not going to be here. You have a prior engagement. You are going to be moderating a federal leaders debate that I've heard something about. Want to share some details about that?
Not really.
Will you anyway?
There are 2 debates during the writ period, one in French on Wednesday night, and then, of course, the English debate on Thursday night. And it's taking place in Montreal, so I cannot be here. So what it means is you and I are going to tape a podcast, an On Poly podcast. I'll be in Montreal, you'll be here, and because of the timing of this, it puts us in a bit of a pickle because next week is a big week at Queen's Park, right?
Yes, the legislature is going to be returning, and we'll get a throne speech. We'll see a new speaker elected. Probably, I would imagine, at least some important legislation introduced. So we're going to have stuff to talk about, even if you're not here.
Could be the first. Well, I'm not going to be here in this location, but we will be on the pod
podcast
together.
Yes.
Yeah, and it could be the first ever female speaker of the legislature elected. First ever one elected. So, there could be some history made, and we don't want to miss all that. So our episode next week will focus on the events at Queen's Park, and we will hold off doing our post-mortem on the leaders' debate, the English leaders' debate, I suspect more likely. We'll hold off on that until Easter Monday.
Yes.
Right? So have I got all that right?
Yes, that's the current plan.
Okay. So remind everybody,
right,
next Thursday. I got to make sure I'm in the right city at the right time. I'd hate to be here next Thursday when I really need to be there. But anyway, what's happening?
So you can watch the federal leaders English language debate here on TVO April 17th from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. It will also be on our live stream at TVO.org and on our TVO Today YouTube channel, moderated by somebody named Steve Paikin.
Not familiar with his work.
I've heard of him, I'm pretty sure.
I've heard he's overrated. Yeah, I've heard all that. Anyways, moving right along, there's one other news item we wanted to briefly mention off the top here, and that's because it is a court decision of some note, and it refers to, I think, fair to say, one of Doug Ford's former nemesis back in the day. Okay, you want to tell us what happened in that court decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is about Randy Hillier, who was a former MPP, was first elected in 2007 and served until 2022. He was expelled from the Tory caucus in 2019, not that long after the election that brought Doug Ford to the Premier's office. And he further alienated the Tory caucus during COVID when he very publicly disagreed with many public health measures, which is how we get to today's news. Hillier had been charged with violating the regulations that the province had passed concerning public gatherings during the pandemic emergency. The lower court, the trial court, had found that these laws breached people's charters' rights to peaceful assembly, but that the law was still permissible because of Section 1 of the Charter, which basically says that while we are guaranteed all of these rights, they can be infringed, provided that the infringements are justifiable in a free and democratic society.
Reasonable.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The decision this week is from the Court of Appeal, Ontario's highest court. The unanimous three-judge decision said that, in fact, those rules were too onerous and did not pass the Section 1 test. These were rules against outdoor public gatherings that Hillier was charged under, and the court found that there was really insufficient evidence of harm from outdoor gatherings during COVID. People can remember how we were all encouraged, in fact, to spend more time outdoors where, we were less likely to transmit the disease. The court contrasted those rules with rules that had previously been saved by the courts that included things like closing churches to indoor services, right? Exercise of religion is also a charter right, but the court said there was a much clearer connection to the rule and the harm that it was trying to prevent. So the Court of Appeal found that these rules against outdoor gatherings were too onerous, were not salvaged or saved by Section 1, and that Hillier's charges were null and void.
So victory for Randy Hillier.
Yeah, victory for Randy Hillier, and not the only victory he's had recently. He last year had criminal charges dropped against him. These were charges stemming from his participation in the Ottawa convoy incidents, and those charges were dropped because his criminal case was taking too long, and the right to a speedy trial is also a charter right that the courts protect.
So what's interesting here is that the Court of Appeal has decided his rights have been infringed upon, but of course it's kind of too late now to remedy that situation. So I guess the court is going to spend a little bit of time figuring out how Randy Hillier can get his justice ultimately, because finding a remedy at this stage is going to be tough, given that all the protests are over.
Yes. Well, I suspect that, the remedy here is that Randy Hillier does not have to pay any of the fines or bear any of the penalties that the law might have otherwise required. But I think it's worth, just remembering. I mean, we said this a lot recently because it's like that anniversary, right? But it's 5 years since COVID, and this is not the only COVID case that is still making its way through Ontario's court system. There are lots of things that are, other people who, every week I see, a business that opened in defiance of the regulations, or people who, exercises of religion, or licensed professionals who got themselves into trouble over, issuing fake vaccination exemptions, right? Those kinds of things. And people, like, those cases are still all making their way through the courts right now.
And we are making our way to issue 1, so let's do that right now. Donald Trump has announced a 3-month pause on his tariffs, which does not include the measures against Canada and Mexico. So the province is bracing for a long-term fight. It will allow businesses to defer selected provincially administered taxes for 6 months, which will help free up $9 billion to help businesses through this trade war. JMM, let's get some more deets on this if we can.
Right. So speaking of COVID, this might sound familiar because it's the kind of measure that the government also adopted during COVID. This reprieve will be on a bunch of different provincially administered taxes, like the employer health tax, fuel tax, beer, wine, and spirits taxes, and the mining tax. In mining, for instance, taxes are administered on the profits of the extraction of minerals. So mines for now will be able to keep that profit. The period ends October 1st, and all taxes must be paid at that point. So this is a deferral and not just a grant or a giveaway. And the Workplace Safety Insurance Board is also providing $2 billion in rebates to eligible businesses. So the two measures in combination add up to about $11 billion.
That is real money where I come from.
Absolutely,
What's
yes.
been the reaction to it so far?
Well, we mentioned mining. The Ontario Mining Association is pretty happy with it. President Priya Tandon spoke with the Canadian Mining Journal and said she welcomed the temporary tax reprieve. However, she has urged long-term investment and action. Doug Ford has said he wants to speed up approvals in the mining sector, get more mines open, more mines operating. At the end of the day, this is a tax reprieve is just a temporary measure to get businesses through the current crisis. It's not a fundamental shift in the way we permit mines, for example, and it's not a massive expansion of infrastructure in Northern Ontario to assist to those mines, right? Many hope that the tariffs will be negotiated away before the 6 months is up, but God, try predicting what's going to come out of Washington on any given day lately.
Don't think that is a doable thing. Okay, we've heard a lot lately about buy Canadian, don't buy American. And so since we're on the topic of mines here, the Minister of Energy and Mines, Stephen Lecce, has also asked Ontario's energy sector to restrict U.S. suppliers from, and here's the quote, accessing new procurements for the provisions of goods and services that support the energy sector. Okay, so in other words, favor us, don't favor them.
Yeah.
What's the fallout?
When the Minister of Energy says something like that, it's important to note that, there's really only one customer for electricity in the province of Ontario, and it's the province, right? We're talking about large, companies that in some cases are just directly owned by the province. And I'm thinking here of like Ontario Power Generation. Hydro One is not a majority owned by the government anymore. Is it 51% now? I actually lost track. But these are large bodies where the government still exerts a lot of direct influence. And then you have agencies that are largely responsible for long-term energy planning, like the IESO. So,
we hate acronyms here, JMM.
Oh, sorry, it's the Independent Electricity System Operator.
Yeah. The only acronym we allowed here is JMM.
And TVO, I think, also
and
gets
TVO
under
is
the
also
wire.
allowed, yes.
We'll see if the government wants to introduce legislation to force this issue on companies operating in Ontario in the provincial power sector. But even if they don't, when the Minister of Energy says stuff like this, you can imagine that companies operating in the sector are going to pay it a lot of heed.
And what about the Green Party? I saw they put something out the other day on this as well.
Yes. Green leader Mike Schreiner responded saying that he hopes that the minister will reconsider using the American-designed small modular reactor at Darlington. This is a reactor designed by GE Hitachi, an American company. Schreiner points out that the province's plan to also ramp up natural gas power plants and ramp up the usage of those power plants will make us more reliant on natural gas from the U.S. Obviously, Canada does also produce natural gas, but as I mentioned in a previous podcast, at the moment, Ontario imports a lot from the Midwestern U.S. So, Schreiner is on the record opposing new nuclear power in Ontario. He said that on our podcast. But we've discussed the issues with the Darlington SMR and some of the criticisms of it. So this is not purely an issue for the Green Party, and it will be interesting to see. They have not yet started pouring concrete for that new reactor at Darlington yet, but that's coming in coming months. They just got a license approval from the federal government. We'll see whether the provincial government changes its mind anytime soon.
Well, the Premier's already on record as saying that he thinks this American company is the only one that can do this job, and therefore he does not intend to break the contract. Right?
And they believe they've protected Ontario's interests with the contract. They believe that Ontario is going to be able to get a slice of the export market for this technology. The criticism, and I'm thinking of somebody like Chris Kiefer from Canadians for Nuclear Energy, the key question is, can Ontario actually protect its interests when you're talking about American nuclear technology? It's going to be American law and the laws concerning, nuclear technology exports. That's like really serious stuff. That's going to be what determines whether we have the advantages that we hope we have because of this contract. And I'm not sure that's a known answer right now.
We are determined to move on to issue 2, so let's do that. We're now going to discuss John Michael McGrath's favorites. During the recent Ontario election, Doug Ford said he was committed to building a tunnel under Highway 401. Now we're hearing that the feasibility study for this project could take up to 2 years and cost millions of dollars. I know how much you love this project. I know that you cannot wait to see it come to fruition in your lifetime. But do you have any views on this?
Oh, God, this thing is the bane of my existence, man.
Oh, are you kidding? This is your favorite topic.
Okay, I will get to that in a moment. Let's just establish the facts as we know it so far. According to Global News, who first reported on this, the feasibility study will analyze what tunneling options are available. They will consider potential other options, such as an elevated highway. So if you think of like the Gardiner Expressway, the elevated portion in downtown Toronto, maybe it would look something like that. It would provide a high-level cost estimate. When you hear governments say high-level cost estimate, you could just add another zero to the end of that number, whatever it is.
Or maybe 2.
Say that.
Yeah.
It will also investigate other designs and potential environmental and construction considerations.
So it may not be a tunnel. It may be a superhighway on top, an elevated highway?
Potentially. That is one idea that is apparently on the list. Okay, so now we're going to get to my feelings about this topic. This is dumb. This is not going to happen. A tunnel particularly is just not going to happen. And it would be an obscene use of public money if it did.
Cost $100 billion.
Yeah. Even if you assume that we somehow in Ontario became massively better at delivering this stuff on time and on budget, and it were only $50 billion, it would still be an obscene use of public money. The only value here is that the insane cost of the tunnel might make some of the other more realistic options look better. So when we talk about, other modes of travel, like maybe it comes back and says, well, hey, instead of building this silly 401 tunnel, extending subway lines, building new GO train lines, other forms of rapid transit, those things would be a lot more effective and a lot cheaper.
I have to say, I've not talked to a single person, and this includes conservatives, who actually believe this thing will ever occur, right? It just doesn't.
Just look at the political calendar. They're going to be doing a feasibility study for the next 2 years. Do you think that they will quickly go from the feasibility study to procurement and they're going to start construction within the lifetime of this legislature?
Seems unlikely.
Just 4 years?
Seems unlikely.
Sorry,
okay.
no.
Well, if not, look at how do I say this here? This idea was floated by Doug Ford. I'm going to suggest, because he'd done a considerable amount of polling, which this government does, understandably, to find out what the temperature is on a range of issues. And his pollster said to him, people hate the traffic. We know it costs the economy of Ontario billions of dollars in lost productivity because traffic is a nightmare. And so the Premier no doubt thought to himself, I got to come up with something, and this is what he came up with. Now, if they didn't do this Jetsons style of procurement, what other ideas could they do more immediately that might actually alleviate traffic jams?
Well, first of all, the Jetsons had flying cars.
They did.
They would not have needed the tunnel, but...
Oh, we're getting very literal now on me, are we? Yeah, okay.
I'm just old enough to get the Jetsons references. So we've discussed some of the other options that are possible here. Paying for the tolls for commercial freight on Highway 407, right? Diverting some of the trucks from the 401 onto the 407. This would be not cheap. It wouldn't be trivial sums, but it would be cheaper, and it's something you could do quickly, right? It's basically just a matter of the government paying the bill. The Green Party was one of the first parties to float this. If we're talking about the 407, the province could also just buy back the 407, and they could, in theory, remove the tolls from that.
That would cost a lot of money too.
Now that would cost a lot more money. That'd be more like 30 billion.
Yeah.
And large costs, but arguably the current system doesn't make a ton of sense to have one tolled highway in a region of untolled freeways. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we get to the solution not car-owning communists actually favor, which is, congestion pricing, particularly in downtown Toronto. Everywhere that it has been used, it works. It works really well. It works very quickly. And you can watch happening in New York City right now. It is still only months old, the congestion pricing experiment in New York City, and it is getting more popular by the day as they poll even people who have to pay the tolls, who admittedly they don't love having to pay, but it is such a radical change in traffic in downtown New York. The buses are moving better. There's less road rage. There's less honking of horns. They've actually been able to meter that people are honking their horns less because people are less frustrated from the traffic congestion. It is,
and more importantly, it's raising money to spend on public transit.
Exactly right. There's a huge sum of money going to the transit agency that runs the subways in New York City. So. I understand the current government does not...
I was going to say, can I burst your bubble?
Yeah,
I mean, I know you love congestion pricing. We did a program on this on the agenda not too long ago, and I guess London, England was the first major city in the world to start this. And yeah, it does all those things that you said, but the current government of Ontario is never going to bring in congestion pricing for its capital city.
No. Maybe we have to wait until the next provincial election, or I don't know, maybe someday Doug Ford will wake up, I mean literally he'll wake up in bed one day and say, you know what, maybe I was wrong. I'm not holding out a lot of hope for that.
There was another idea that emerged in the last couple of days as to traffic alleviation problems, and it involved using the shoulders of superhighways to allow people to drive on those shoulders. How long did that idea last?
That seemed to last about 10 minutes. I suspect that the Premier's office got a phone call from, among other people, the OPP, saying, actually, we use those shoulders when we need to move cars around, so please don't put rush hour traffic in those shoulders.
Not to mention, if you're going to have an accident, you got to pull a car over and put it somewhere.
Exactly, right? So, yes, the idea was floated. It was made public by the Toronto Star, and the government walked it back very, very quickly. Some countries, it's worth saying, some countries do this, do allow it. The UK and Germany have converted some hard shoulders on their, what they call motorways in their charming Britishisms. But, and you get signage where the highway says where you can and cannot be in the shoulder. That said, there does seem to be a study from the UK that showed that you are 3 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured if your car breaks down on a highway without a hard shoulder available. So maybe it's possible to do this better with better technology, but I wouldn't want to bet my personal security on that.
In which case, let's get out of here and go on to issue 3. Strong Mayor powers will be rolled out to an additional 169 municipalities across Ontario. There are currently 49 municipalities whose mayors have those powers. The province hopes this will help cut red tape and accelerate housing starts. Now, before we get into whether either of those two things will happen, we're going to do a little Superpowers 101 here. Let's go back, because we do remember this was a bit of a thing when Premier Ford first made these powers available to some mayors in the province. And people went, oh, holy smokes, what are they? They're allowed to do that? They're allowed to do that? So what are they allowed to do?
Right. So these powers give mayors the ability to hire and fire specific administrative officials. So like the chief administrative officer in a city or other officers, with a handful of positions that are protected in the law that cannot be hired and fired by the mayor. They give the mayor much stronger control over the city's budget. And there are policy areas where the mayor can veto decisions by city council if they conflict with provincial priorities. So in particular, home building and transit infrastructure. So these new cities, the 169 cities that are getting these powers, are generally small cities and towns with councils of 6 or more members. So that's the mayor plus 5. I think it's actually notable. There was just, you ever seen asterisk in a press release and start hunting for what's going on there? And in this case, there was an asterisk next to Orillia, which is getting these powers officially later this month, but was actually given strong mayor powers last week or so to react to the ice storm and power outage that they've been dealing with there. We haven't talked about it on the podcast, but it's a big deal. Like more than 100,000 people were without power for days. And so the mayor of Orillia was given strong mayor powers in a sort of a temporary fashion, but that will now become permanent later this month.
Now, the idea here is, of course, if you've got, let's say, half your council that are beset by NIMBYites, right?
Yes.
No building in my backyard. This would give a strong mayor the ability to overrule half or even a slight majority of council, right? And get homes built against the wishes of potentially the majority of council. So let's ask the question, has that in fact happened since the strong mayor powers were given?
Right. So Toronto and Ottawa have had these powers longest in Ontario municipalities. And according to CMHC, this is the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, housing starts in the provincial capital have fallen 68% year over year. I'm not saying, one, therefore two, but there are obviously many complicated factors at play in how homes get built. But it's really debatable how much the strong mayor powers have contributed to housing starts in the province. It's kind of confusing to me because the province seems to have largely walked away from really serious reforms to the planning system. And I'm using that very broadly to mean not just like zoning and planning regulations and development charges, but the whole thing. They really haven't done much, certainly not in the last year or so. But meanwhile, they're moving ahead with these strong mayor powers, which just don't seem to be moving the needle very much. So we'll see. It's certainly possible events could prove me wrong in the future, but so far, these strong mayor powers just have not done a ton to get more homes built.
Well, I do recall as well, there were some mayors who said, you may want to give me these strong mayor powers, but I don't intend to use them, right? They thought it was somewhat anti-democratic. How's that going?
Right. So at least as it was initially offered, you had to have a city council, I guess they offered resolutions of consent or not. And 2 years ago, Newmarket, New Tecumseh, and Haldimand and Norfolk County refused to take these powers. We have Shelley Ann Bentley, who was then the mayor of Haldimand County, said that she believed the powers could be used to force municipalities to, for example, fire an administrative officer who the province felt was holding up their housing goals. And the province could then dictate who was hired into the new vacancy. That's a bit of a speculative scenario, I will grant. And then we had Newmarket Mayor John Taylor, who was quoted at the time saying that the housing goals he'd been set up to achieve with these strong mayor powers were literally impossible. That's his quotation. So he refused the powers on those grounds. Newmarket happens to be still on the list of cities not receiving strong mayor powers this time around. And then, there's certainly, like we saw, Mike Schreiner has put out a release once again saying that he believes that strong mayor powers are undemocratic. He's been critical of this move since the beginning. And there are concerns about how mayors actually use these powers. Mississauga Mayor Carolyn Parrish, who won the election to replace Bonnie Crombie not that long ago, ago. She used her strong mayor powers to dismiss a number of the higher officials at Mississauga Council when she took over. Not like unusual in a governmental sense for there to be turnover in staff when, for example, there's a new premier or a new prime minister. It is a bit different at the municipal level. We generally don't see that kind of turnover when the mayors change.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a couple of examples just before we thoroughly exhaust this topic. I do remember Andrea Horwath, the mayor of Hamilton, using her so-called strong mayor powers to overrule, I guess it was to break a tie. Council was deadlocked. It was an even vote on whether to take a parking lot and build subsidized housing, social housing on that site. The mayor was in favor. She could not get a majority on council, so she just, as they say, rammed it through, and that will happen now. There's another story up in Aurora in York Region. The mayor, Tom Marakis, has used his strong mayor powers to veto a proposal for a men's shelter, which would have provided temporary housing. 4 councillors in Aurora, a majority on the council, wanted the shelter. A very vocal group of constituents did not want the shelter. The mayor vetoed the vote in February using his strong mayor powers, and there is some irony here in as much as in using his powers given him to get housing built, he's in fact preventing housing from being built for a group of very vulnerable people who need it.
Yeah.
So there we go.
And I think this is a problem that continually besets provincial governments when they cook up ideas in the premier's office or in a minister's office about how things are going to work with municipalities, and then when you actually implement them in the real world, municipalities have different ideas.
There you go. Okay, with that, on to your column, my column. It's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org this past week. What did you write about that you want to share with the class?
So there is a breach between 2 large unions in North America. You have the United Auto Workers in the U.S., the largest automaking union, which has become, or at least his leader, Sean Fain, has become one of the big defenders of Donald Trump's tariffs, arguing that this is going to reverse the globalization that has so reduced the numbers and power of the UAW membership. On the other side of that, you have Lana Payne of Unifor, who Unifor was formed by a merger of the Canadian Auto Workers and another union. They were once, the CIW and UAW were once a single union. Lana Payne is very opposed to Trump's tariffs, and she, I think, correctly believes that these tariffs and this trade war are going to be very, very bad for her members and for auto workers generally. So I wrote a bit about this breach, and quite frankly, I think just on the facts alone, I believe I used the line in the piece that Sean Fain is going to be remembered as one of history's greatest suckers, because there's just no way this is going to end up being good for workers generally, and particularly not good for American auto workers, in part because it looks like Trump may very well succeed in inducing a recession, and people tend not to buy big, expensive cars when there's a recession on. I say a bit more in the piece, but I will just say that in this particular instance, I think, I believe Unifor's leadership is correct and the UAW's leadership is badly wrong. And I suppose as a disclosure, I should mention that some of our colleagues here at TVO are represented by Unifor, though you and I are not.
They are taking our pictures as we speak.
Yes.
There we go.
How about you?
This past week, I wrote a column about, it's funny how Donald Trump can make strange bedfellows out of many different kinds of people here. 3 former Ontario political adversaries who came together to give a seminar on how to create a united stand against Donald Trump. 3 former adversaries. Who am I talking about? Former Premier Kathleen Wynne, a Liberal. Former PC Party leader Tim Hudak, Conservative. Brian Topp, who once ran for the leadership of the federal NDP and has been a strategist for New Democratic Party candidates all over the place. None of the 3 of them acknowledged ever having to handle an issue as big as the Trump tariff trade war before. But they all had some ideas on what we could do, and in fact, they did share some of their experiences. For example, Kathleen Wynne, when she was the Premier of Ontario, and I'm going to go back, I guess, about 12 years now, there was a everything old is new again, right? There was a big ice storm
Yeah.
12 years ago, and there were seniors who were trapped in their buildings and could not get out and were without power for a very long time, couldn't get food, couldn't get out of their buildings if they were trapped on high floors, for example, of apartment buildings. And Kathleen Wynne, sort of as the head of the government of the day, asks herself, okay, what do we do here? Well, the first thing you do is you find out who's in trouble and how do we help them. Yeah. And those are essentially the same good questions that decision makers are asking right now as it relates to the tariff war. Tim Hudak talked about his time right after 9/11. So we're going back to 2001 now. He happened to be the tourism minister for the province of Ontario, and he was asking his officials, how do we protect the cultural industries of this province, given that, planes have been forced down and nobody's going to be traveling anywhere, and, what do we do? Brian Topp talked about the insanity of selling 98% of our energy resources to one customer who doesn't like us anymore. So, and we just cannot be reliant on the U.S. Going forward in the way that we have been in the past. I think the thing that stayed with me the most from the discussion was Kathleen Wynne talking about back when she was a grade 6 student, which would have been in 1963, and they announced at her school that President John F. Kennedy had just been assassinated. And Canadians and Americans apparently felt so close to one another back then, or certainly we did to them, that they sent all the kids home, they shut down school, people cried. I mean, it was a very emotional moment for Canada as well, not just the United States, because we liked Kennedy and we felt close to that country. I don't have to tell you, those conditions do not exist anymore today.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a real point of sadness that the relationship that was so close has been so badly disrupted.
There was a difference of opinion among Kathleen Wynne and Tim Hudak as to whether or not the relationship has been irreparably damaged forever.
Right.
I think Premier Wynne was closer to that view. Tim Hudak was of the view that it's been damaged, it's been bruised, but we'll get it back. Doesn't feel that way right now, but who knows? We'll obviously in the years ahead, we'll figure out who called that one right. Now, what are we doing now?
We're going to the mailbag right
Okay,
now.
let's do that. If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. The email address is onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, take us through it if you would.
Today, we have an email from a listener in Brazil.
No kidding.
Clovis de Andres, who writes, Dear Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath, a message just to say that I've been enjoying your programs and wit since 2020, listening on and off from Brazil over YouTube, beginning but not limited to The Agenda. I look forward to listening to any comments you may have on Brazilian politics or occasional repercussions of it in your neck of lumberjack country with the inevitably welcome Ontarian/Canadian view. The lumberjack reference is mentioned with the utmost respect for Canadian industriousness and iconography, although maybe not for deforestation, a problem which is always and more current in Brazil. Cheers, Clovis DeAndre.
Do you know when I read this, the first thing I thought of was about 25 years ago, we did a program here on childcare. Yeah. And I got an email from somebody in Sweden who said, wow, you guys are dealing with the same issues on childcare we are here. I saw your show about this, and we're going to take some of the ideas that I learned about in that show and we're going to bring them here. And I just thought, my goodness, it is such a small world now where at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, people can be watching what we do in Sweden or in this case in Brazil and be influenced by it. So that's fantastic. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to add about the state of Brazilian politics nowadays, but we do have some views on lumberjack country, don't we?
I mean, speaking of lumber, of course, Canada and Brazil, turns out, are two of the largest exporters of this building material to the United States, or at least we were. Canada has been hit with higher duties on its exports, while Brazil is facing that 10% across-the-board tariff, at least as we record this.
Yes.
Brazil and Canada, alongside Mexico, are the three largest steel exporters to the United States, and we are all feeling the sting of the 25% steel tariffs, particularly in Ontario, because of the large auto manufacturing sector we have here. So united in pain at the moment. We are seeing that Brazil is poised to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. The Brazilian Congress apparently passing legislation that would allow its president, this is Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva, to implement tariffs. President Lula, as he's called, has been a strong opponent of Donald Trump's trade war. I think he's been an antagonist to, this must be his second American Republican president who he's irritated, I swear, because I feel like Lula was picking fights with George W. Bush back in the day. So that's basically exhausting almost the entirety of my knowledge of Brazil. The only other thing I guess would add is that it's probably not a bad time to be a Brazilian agricultural exporter because China's tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports probably mean good things if you grow like soy in Brazil, which I understand the Brazilians do. So anyway, all the best, of course, to our friends and listeners in Brazil.
In fact, let's say to Clovis, now that we know that you're watching us in Brazil, we're going to keep an eye on Brazilian politics, and we'll just drop a nugget in here when you least expect it. There we go. Why don't you give the email one more time?
Absolutely. If you'd like to ask about any content on the show or just chime in from wherever in the world you are listening, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
Yeah, and now that we've heard from Brazil, come on, you folks in Argentina, we want to hear from you now. That is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, April 11th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Here are 4 leading pollsters and some of the numbers that they have. This is the latest federal polling. I think this is as of this morning for the election campaign. Here's David Colletto's group off the top, Abacus, which has essentially got the race tied, 39-39 between liberals and conservatives. NDP at 11, of course. We won't go into the smaller parties for now. Liaison, that's Valentin's group over here. He's got 45-39, liberals over conservatives. Poly, that's Aaron Kelly's artificial intelligence algorithm, 39-36, so liberals up 3. And then the Signal has got 42-40. Now, here's my question. Okay, Valentin, can you all be right?
Well, yeah, we all can be right. I think one thing to keep in mind about most surveys is that they come with a margin of error. And so we're not saying it's going to be 38. We're saying it's going to be 38 within 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 percentage points. So if the poll comes, the poll says 38, but the actual number is 39, that's actually considered quite good.
Aaron Kelly, you look at these numbers and nobody has the same numbers. So people will reasonably ask, how can you all be right? What's the answer?
It's just like David said. It's your, I can give you an example of how we create the
Please.
data to illustrate why sometimes you're going to have margins of error. So in our case, what Polly is doing, she's doing a randomized controlled representative sample of the population from social media. So we're really, we've been doing this for 15 years. So Polly does a random crawl through the graph. It's a probabilistic sample, which is the gold standard for getting the sample, and we've got millions of people in the sample. So we're very convinced that we know that we've got, and we've tested and measured, we've got a great representative sample. We know if we say they're in Ottawa, they're in Ottawa. Here's the trick, though. The ridings are different from the cities, right? So it's very easy for us or for Polly to determine that you live in Toronto and that David Coletto lives in Ottawa, even neighborhoods we can get down to. Ridings are much more challenging, right? So if you're in Ottawa and we know you're in the Glebe, do we know which riding in particular you're in? People don't usually identify with their riding. A campaign is 36 days long. So people might say, well, this candidate came to visit me, and we say, okay, that's that riding. So we've got those breadcrumbs. But we have to do those by hand. So we have to feed those to Polly by hand because they're so unusual, right? And they change.
Okay, let me follow up with David Coletto on this. Because, David, you've got the race tied 39-39 today. And the other David Valentin here, has got a 6-point lead for the Liberals. So again, people will reasonably ask, how can you both be right? What's the answer?
Well, I think there's always other factors in determining how we get these estimates, right? So my survey is done using online panels, and David's uses, I believe, IVR, which is a telephone survey based on an automated telephone survey. And so those, what we call mode effects, can come into the results, right? So in the case of a telephone survey, for example, I believe right now, Liberal Canadians, those who are going to vote Liberal, are more engaged right now. They're more likely to be picking up the phone, more likely to be answering the survey. So I think what we call response bias may be in part why you're seeing some of the telephone-based research being more favorable to the Liberals. On the other hand, other pollsters, like myself, make some adjustments in our weighting that might push down that Liberal vote because our NDP number is slightly higher. So there's choices that every pollster makes that might get us to different results. But in the end of the day, I think David's right that we're still fundamentally seeing the Liberals having an advantage, even if those top line numbers are slightly different.
David, do you have a view as to whether or not you get superior numbers, more accurate numbers, if you do it by telephone, off social media, off the internet? What?
Well, I think on average, my sense of it is if I'm doing a political project, I prefer telephone. But everyone has their own methodology, and there's perfectly valid reasons why online panel sometimes takes a little longer to catch up. We've seen this in other elections where there's a little bit of a lag effect. But usually in the final week of the campaign, we always more or less end up at the same place. So even though we have a little bit of a difference now, I think in the end, we'll probably be just a few points away from each other.
Generally speaking, do you think it's in Canada's best interests to retaliate with counter tariffs?
Generally speaking, the economics would tell you, no, we should not impose tariffs, but that's not the situation we find ourselves in. As you pointed out, we have retaliated against the unjustified measures that Donald Trump has put in place already. There are three good reasons for it that are probably not textbook economics. First is to keep cohesion here at home. That's absolutely essential in terms of the transitions that we're facing ahead. The next reason is to try and move some of the views of Americans, or at least prevent cohesion behind the craziness that is Donald Trump. And then the other thing, too, is remember, we can't give up what we aren't already doing. So some of those tariffs were imposed on Canada because of supposed fentanyl. We're not exporting fentanyl to the United States. So in this kind of new arrangement with the U.S., we have to have some kind of tribute to give up. And so for that reason, we want to have tariffs to be able to give up at a later stage.
Ian, what about you? Counter tariffs, good or bad?
They're the worst possible solution that we could adopt right now. We have known since Adam Smith, David Ricardo, 250 years ago, right down to, 10 days ago in Toronto, when Governor Macklem gave an excellent speech summarizing the research of the Bank of Canada economists, and they found absolutely not one single redeeming argument in favor of tariffs. They increase prices to ordinary Canadians. They are going to drive up inflation. It's going to make life more affordable. And in the research by Professor Tom at University of Calgary, he showed that the impact on the U.S. is trivial. And the logic is arithmetic. When you take the total cost or estimated amount of the Canadian retaliatory tariffs and simply divide by the 30 trillion GDP, you probably have to go to 7 or 8 or 9 decimal points to the right of the decimal point before you hit a significant digit other than zero. In other words, the impact of a couple of $100 billion on a $30 trillion economy is similar to a multimillionaire finding a loonie on the sidewalk and thinking they just became rich. The impact is negligible.
All right,
and
we'll
so
get to Trevor Tomb's
be
analysis in just a second here, because I'm glad you raised him. We are going to come back to him. First, let me get Drew on this. What's your view?
Well, I agree with Jennifer, and I agree with Ian. How's that? But there's also politics to be considered. Our situation with the United States, we're not a small economy. We're a medium-sized economy, 9th biggest in the world, but we are the biggest economy dependent on one other big player, the super heavyweight. And we're more dependent on them than the United States than they are on us. In those circumstances, I think in particular, as Ian points out, we're not going to hurt them as much with retaliatory tariffs as we might hurt ourselves. Nevertheless, we're in the middle of an election, and I think credibility states for those political parties, and let's talk about reality, that there has to be some sort of retaliation, in part because Canadians expected. We're actually the outlier, to go back to Ian's point about pure economics. Of the 20 major trading partners with the United States, only 2 have retaliated. China, which could easily escalate, and us. And we did it in such a way that we worked hard to ensure that they didn't counter retaliate, and we'll see how that where that goes going forward.
I mean, Jennifer, let's touch on the political angle here. In the middle of an election campaign, can any self-respecting leader of a major political party not threaten the United States with countervailing tariffs and expect to win, given that 70% of the Canadian public wants them?
No, they can't. They have to impose some sort of countermeasure. And look, if countermeasures, counter tariffs were the only thing that Canada was doing, then we might worry. But don't forget, there's also been a huge amount of diplomatic efforts. There's been a massive public advertising campaign in the States. So I think we need to see these counter tariffs as part of a broader strategy. Again, where there are economic goals to consider, but there are also political goals. And frankly, we're not dealing necessarily with a standard rational actor in the Trump administration. I would point out it's really interesting, I think, that we have managed to avoid the so-called liberation round of retaliatory measures from the U.S. And I think that's worth paying attention to.
Ian, as promised, we're going to come back to Trevor Toome, the economist from out west, who calculated, here's his numbers here, a 25% blanket tariff, he says, would have 40 times the impact on Canada versus the same tariff levied by Canada on the United States. As you indicated, basically a pimple on the back of an elephant. Having said that, should we be basing our response on spreadsheets alone?
It's not on spreadsheets alone. It comes down to, I guess I'm going to quote Kissinger, you know, we have to be strategic in this. Cutting off our nose to spite our face, to use a famous cliche, is not prudent.
Rachel, you first. How, in your view, has Donald Trump's second term changed the narrative on the oil industry in our country?
Well, I think one of the things it's done is that we're all talking about the oil industry here, and we're talking about pipelines, we're talking about exports, and I think the risk is we're letting it suck up some of the oxygen in the room. And the way that we're saying, all of a sudden as a country realizing, you know, having all of our eggs in the basket of the United States is a big risk. Having all of our conversation about our economic future and potential around fossil fuels is a big risk. We're sitting today in a very different place than we were in the 1970s. We've seen reductions of up to 90% in cost on renewable energy, on batteries, and we're seeing, you know, for economic reasons, like climate change aside, there is a massive movement towards more efficiently powered transportation, industry, energy through electrification. And while Canada sits here in this moment thinking about who do we want to be when we look back 50 years from now, looking to those opportunities as places we need to be putting our investment dollars and our energy in lieu of an industry which is inherently volatile and very much, proven to be in decline, although I'm sure we'll have debate about how quickly and how much.
Well, let's have that debate. But before we get there, Heather, why don't you weigh in on that issue of Trump's second term and how it's changed the conversation around this sector?
Yeah, well, I mean, for most of us, the conversation changed before when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we really started to think about energy security. Before that, I think climate policy was dominating European discussions, North American discussions. And then we started to think, you know, energy is not a subset of climate policy. It is the most important thing to our economy. I don't mean oil to Canada's economy. I mean the availability of affordable energy for any economy, for manufacturing, for transportation, for, living, all those things. And so the conversation for me changed 2 or 3 years ago, and we've seen a little bit of the green lash. And I think that's kind of what propelled Trump, and that's propelled a lot of right-wing governments to be elected in Europe, is a reaction to, this kind of monolithic focus on climate policy. And so I think what the Trump discussion now has done is a lot more Canadians are literate about the importance of oil and gas to our economy, to our exports, to our trade balance. And looking at what is the lowest hanging fruit for us to diversify, to get other trading partners, to enhance our productivity. That is still oil and gas.
Rory, what say you?
I generally agree with Heather's point here. I obviously think that there is room to invest in a whole bunch of different aspects of the energy system. But I think that when you look at our comparative advantage as a country, we have some of the largest oil reserves in the world. We have the largest oil reserves within the Western Alliance, within the OECD. We have just gobs of potential. And it's really about using that in the most responsible way to finance all the other things that we want to do. So I think that Canada can both continue to green its domestic economy while also supporting and facilitating the expansion of the oil sands in particular as a booming export economy. And when we're talking about reliance on the United States, part of the challenge here is that it's always been easier and cheaper to build pipelines to the United States. The industries co-evolved together. The refineries are perfectly geared to produce our grades of heavier, sour crude. But when we're talking about kind of forcibly diversifying away from that, and I think that is a major and obvious now political and diplomatic risk for the sector. Now, what we have seen is that Trump, despite repeatedly and falsely saying that the United States doesn't need our oil or our timber or our cars or whatever.
They're just buying all that stuff because they like us so
Yeah,
much.
they're just being nice about it, right? But what we have seen is that both in the Canada-Mexico tariffs, we have now seen oil across the board exempted under the USMCA compliance exemption, and even with these latest reciprocal tariffs, which aren't actually reciprocal, but we'll leave that for now, that were announced on Liberation Day, also explicitly excluded energy. So despite Trump's kind of bravado around kind of the United States being energy dominant, enough voices within his orbit still recognize that they need broad energy imports and oil imports, with specifically Canadian imports.
Don, to the extent this has come up in the Canadian election campaign over the last few weeks, there have been some good discussions, I think, among the candidates on whether we need to build more pipelines east-west in this country and whether we need to have our own refining capacity in this country rather than sending everything down south. How do you regard that question?
Well, I think the issue there is, I think it would have been a brilliant idea in 1980 to build the pipelines. I think it would have been a viable idea 25 years ago. My fear right now is, because of the cost of that infrastructure and because of the timeline, if we look at 12 years and $34 billion for the Trans Mountain, and here we have a longer pipeline, we'd be doing 1,600 kilometers of new pipeline, I think 3,000 of retrofitting existing pipelines. So if we, who knows what the price is, but if it was $50 billion in 15 years, what does the energy landscape look like in 2040? And I just think, we could be sending, I think that the medium and long-term risk is too great.
And that is the agenda for Friday, April 11th, 2025. Monday on the program, we'll get a dual citizen's perspective on living in the U.S. during a trade war. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday.